And the last one for today, Ryan Lackey with Travel Security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is my first Balkan, first time in the Balkans. It's great. I've loved it. I went to some countries around here, got to see it, and Novi Sad's beautiful. I got to meet lots of great people, and it's a great conference. So yeah, my name's Ryan Lackey, and I'm going to go over basically travel security for both this audience and for how this audience can help other people. We're going to talk about the relative risks of different types of travel, and then different ways to be safer when you travel, because there's really no absolutes in computer security, especially in this kind of thing. And there's some research and development people can work on. And the most, I don't know if I would call it might be exciting, but also sort of negative thing that's happened over the last year has been a lot of assumptions we made are no longer true about travel to certain countries. So now we have 100% more Donald Trump. So I'm a cypherpunk from the early 1990s. I was involved in the mailing list back in the mid-90s when I was a teenager. I did this offshore data haven called Haven Co. in the North Sea, where we took a self-declared sovereign World War II anti-aircraft platform that declared itself its own country and ran a data center from it so that we could do all sorts of crazy hosting. I worked as a contractor in Iraq, Afghanistan, some other places for about 8 years, which was a very, very long time. I did a trusted computing startup, so all the Intel TXT, Intel SGX technology applied to servers, so you could do remote attestation to prove what code is running on those servers, which is really cool technically, but didn't really have a market at the time. Maybe there's a market in the future. Then I sold that company to Cloudflare, which I'm sure a lot of people know about. It's a DDoS mitigation security company. And now I have a startup that's making secure computing for people that travel, which is very fun. But I'm going to talk about more general solutions that use open source technology and opportunities for people to work on their own stuff here. So that stuff's interesting, but there's a lot of stuff that's more important about why I'm somewhat knowledgeable about this. I travel a lot. I've gone through like 4 passports in the last 15 years because they fill up. I've traveled to over 100 countries. I've been at home this year about 3 weeks, and last year I was at home about 5 weeks. I travel like internationally mostly more than I travel domestically, and I take a lot of computer gear. Like I have a Pelican 1615 big Pelican case full of equipment with me and a bunch of other stuff, and I'm sure I'm on lists. So I have a lot of experience traveling with electronics to exciting places. Travel's special for a lot of reasons. When you're at home, you're exposed to a single set of laws. You're exposed maybe to your local municipal regulations, your provincial or state regulations, and federal regulations, but only one set of each. You're not really in the state where you're a person who's exposed to multiple countries in the same trip, whereas when you travel, you are, obviously. And the annoying thing is that even countries that have really strong privacy laws or protections generally make an exception for customs and border enforcement and for people that are not citizens of the country. As a US citizen, when I'm in the United States, like in the middle of the United States, I have probably the strongest protections against certain kinds of disclosure anywhere. But when I'm traveling, even as a US person visiting the country at the borders, I have a lot less protections. And as a non-citizen visiting the US, you have a lot less protections there. You're away from all your support, so all your friends, if you had a problem like said, this doesn't seem right that they're doing this, you don't really know. Just language also, if you're traveling to a country where you don't speak the local language, you're in a lot less position to be able to get assistance or to understand what's going on. Like if somebody puts a piece of paper in front of you, says sign this and you get out, and you can't read it, you might be inclined to sign something that you wouldn't if you knew what it was saying. And it's a really nice filter. Like the people that travel internationally are really attractive targets for government surveillance, for a lot of other surveillance. And it sort of separates out the people that are the most interesting for them to target from the people that are just sort of day by day. And it's always changing. So this has always been something that people cared about, like spies, international government people, everyone else that traveled across borders worried about this a lot. There's like a whole, like if you look at any of the government agencies, you have like the number of people who are actually like field operative type people is probably like 5–10% of the total. They probably have like 60% of their organization that's devoted to support, technical, logistics, everything else. And so this has been a problem they've always worked on. But now we have economic espionage. So you have organizations, companies, universities, individuals that are exposed to the same kind of threat, and I certainly don't have a 60% or a 6x me backing me up to do like IT security for me when I travel. So it's sort of an unfair new playing ground. And we had a lot of, traditionally, like there were a lot of countries that were much more sort of laid back on all this stuff that have gotten a lot crazier recently. And part of that's due to terrorism, but in a lot of cases, it's terrorism being used as a front for economic concerns, either economic concerns where they want to extract data from the traveler, or economic concerns where they just want to harass people and cause lots of annoying stuff. And there's a lot of people that travel, and I'm probably an outlier in how many devices I travel with, but a lot of people travel with computers, laptops, phones, tablets, everything else today. So there's a lot of people that travel with a lot of devices. So the travel we're talking about is mainly international travel, mainly travel where you're going to a new place. Like if you're traveling back and forth between two countries all the time, you're a lot more familiar with the procedures. If you're traveling for the first time to a new place, it's different, but routine is also a risk. So there's that. Okay, so we can sort of figure out who's the high-risk people on this interesting scale. I don't know who came up with it, but 0 to Snowden. So like 0 risk was probably somebody who completely uninteresting to government people or to anyone that's spying. And then obviously if Snowden crossed any border, he would be a super target for anybody. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are becoming more targets than they used to be. But you don't need to be the target yourself. If you have access to somebody either personally or technically or whatever else, and they're a target, you can become a target as well, which is really unfortunate because you end up with people's secretaries being targeted, you end up with people's friends being targeted, just as a way to get data about the actual target. And it's sort of done on a profiling basis. If you're traveling from a certain country that is an interesting country, that can make you a target, even if you're the least an interesting person possible, like, yeah, which is crazy. And unfortunately, this sort of, like, the pain here is not spread out universally. Once you're a target once, you become a target, like, every time you go through. They flag you, and it's just constant aggravation. So there's that. And the more they find, the more of a target you become. It sucks because it's a hard problem. No silver bullet in security in general, but this is a particularly painful problem because it's got so many variables. From helping people with this, the number one problem I would say is probably that the people you're helping are not the easiest to work with because they're usually like not computer security professionals, and they're also fairly important people. So either in their own organization or just in general, so they're not as likely to take this as their number one concern. They're more concerned about doing their actual job. So there's a problem there. And yeah, it's a pain. But this you could sort of say about everything, so we're going to try to limit the scope here to what's in scope and out of scope. I would say government personnel, no reason really talking about how to protect them because they have their own internal policies in their organizations. And if you're Snowden, like there's really nothing that anyone can realistically do other than say just don't travel, stay in one place, and like basically completely change your life and isolate yourself. That's like way beyond the scale where stuff can happen. And if you're somebody who's not a target because you only travel between like, internal to your own country, or you're not really a target at all, there's not really too much to worry about there. So there's that. So we want to find somebody who's like right in the right range. And I had one thing before that was a really good problem for this, and I worked on that for a while. And thanks to recent politics, and we now have another one. So there's factors that sort of make this more of a risk or less of a risk. How much of a target, how targeted you are. And then the attacks that are going up against you, they vary in how intrusive they are. So if you're being subjected to very intrusive attacks, you have different levels of protection. And then how hostile the attacker is willing to be. There's a lot of cases where they're willing to do a little bit and push you a little bit, but they're not willing to do too much. So we can talk about that. But yeah. So basically, if you're a target because you travel to a country, or if you're a target because you have posted like some general thing, you're less of a target than if you have something more specific. I mean, they look at it from a sort of statistical perspective. There are a certain number of travelers traveling from a certain country A to country B. There's a lot of people that that fit that profile, but people that have gone to a certain meeting or people that have posted certain, or are part of certain organizations are going to be much more targeted than people that are more general. So they're going to focus on people that are much more targeted. So we're going to talk about that. And then there's sort of a scale of how intrusive the attacks are. I would say sort of purely passive attacks, mainly network attacks, are sort of par for the course. Like if I ever go to a place, even within the US, I would assume that my network traffic could be monitored. It's probably the case that it's not monitored most of the time, except in the most general way at like an exchange point or something, but it's always safer to assume this rather than not. And if you're going to a conference that's a very interesting academic conference or a security conference or something connecting to a public network, it's a pretty safe assumption that there's somebody monitoring the network. If they're not government, they could be somebody else. And then sort of like active network attacks are the next level up. They're like somebody puts either fake AP or a IMSI catcher or something else on your network, or all sorts of exciting, fun network things that don't require physical touching of the machine. That's another level because they're actually doing something. They could get caught, but they're you know there's bad traffic going on, but you can't really localize it to a person. You're not going to put a lot of resources into that. So there's that. Then there's the problem that's sort of unique to the travel problem of physical non-destructive access, where they get temporary access to your machine and they either image the drive, they compel you to turn over a password, whatever else. But this is a one-time thing where they're taking it and they're looking at the device once and they're doing something once. Then we have the two much more serious problems that are either physical modification, where somebody takes a machine and either puts software or hardware implants onto this device and starts monitoring that way, or where they tamper with it in some other way so that it defeats your security procedures. This is mainly done around sort of the evil maid problem of multi-touch interaction with the device, where great, you've got full disk encryption on your machine, but if I put a keylogger on your device in either the hardware or in some piece of firmware or software that's outside of the regular operation, and I can capture your password and I've already imaged your device, then it's kind of game over. So there's that evil maid problem. That's a much more intrusive problem because it requires multiple access, but in the travel situation, it's fairly easy to engineer. Then how persistent this is. Like, I'm usually, people are worried about data, like a single piece of data is not usually as like much of a problem as if I can say there's this new person that's suddenly interested in me, give me the last like multiple months of all that person's communications and information. So historical data is a problem, and then future access is a problem. So if somebody decides to attack a device, put an implant onto it and attack it there, they can gain future access. So if it remains persistent, it's a big problem. Attack or hostility, how motivated they are. It sort of depends on the organization, how well-resourced that organization is overall. Certainly national intelligence agencies are going to be a lot more well-resourced than local authorities or private organizations, and they're going to devote those resources to people they find most interesting. So you've got sort of a trade-off there. And then you have to think about how bad is it if you fail. Like if you're a human rights activist or a journalist talking with human rights activists in places like Syria or places that have active conflicts or northern Myanmar, someplace like that, where a compromise of your machine could lead to somebody gaining access to the network of all the people you've been talking to and they could actually die. That's a much, much more serious problem than if somebody just reads like my emails when I travel internationally. So there's how much you're willing to put into defending it there, how much risk you are if it's compromised, like criminal liability. Like civil problems are a problem, but criminal problems are a problem. And criminal problems in a country that you live in or a country that you have a lot of connections to or routinely visit are a much bigger problem than criminal problems in a country that you never visit. And sort of a financing problem. I mean, generally intelligence agencies aren't worried about gathering data, exploiting it, and then using the funds to fund their operations, but commercial organizations often will attack to gain something they can then exploit. So if you had a bunch of Bitcoin, if you're a known like an exchange operator for a Bitcoin exchange or something, and compromising your machine will lead to potentially compromising an exchange, getting access to a lot of cryptocurrency, then you become an economic target of pop that box and get a bunch of crypto coins. So that makes it more of an issue. Unfortunately, how much of a target you are from an attacker and how much resources you have to defend are kind of uncorrelated at this point. It used to be like spy versus spy, US versus USSR, both relatively well-resourced organizations. Now you've got government versus individuals, you've got individual versus government, the complete asymmetry in resources. So you can't really assume that just because you're like not well-resourced, you're only going to be a target of like other people with similar resources. And then degree of exposure. If you're this is more for an organization. If you're an organization that has a lot of people that travel, they're probably not going to go after like the CISO when the CISO travels, because the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, probably has at least a level of paranoia unless they work for a large credit bureau or something. If they're somebody who's more paranoid, they're probably going to put some resources into it. So you attack somebody else who has similar credentials and is maybe less paranoid. And if you have a lot of people, obviously you just have to go after the weakest link or the lowest hanging fruit. So accepting all that, like, let's talk about risk. If you go to North Korea, don't take any computers that you don't want to have them access, because they have the obvious attack of, hey, you're in North Korea, give us all your data, prove to us that you've given all your data, or you stay here for the rest of your life. There's nothing that I can say that'll help you with that. Active conflict zones like Syria. I worked in Iraq and Afghanistan when they were active conflict zones, and if you are like, there's kidnap value. There's a lot of reasons why like you want to be very careful in those places. And if you're getting your advice in an active conflict zone from without like you need a lot of comprehensive advice there, so that's something where you want to go. US EU travel to Russia. Unfortunately, Russia has been a very interesting place. I think the Sochi Olympics were probably the introduction of this kind of stuff to a lot of people, where journalists are being spied on in their rooms, all sorts of active surveillance, network devices being attacked. That's a pretty high level. We could probably work on that somewhat. Used to be low. EU people visiting the US, there's sort of like an interesting like data privacy argument there and stuff, but it wasn't really a big deal, but that's sort of changed in the last year. So that's now a completely relevant thing. And I would say domestic within the US and domestic within the EU, not really big issues here, particularly if you're a special person, yes, but if you're most people not, although hackers probably count as special people in almost all these cases. So it used to be the sweet spot for this was people going to China, like Western people going to China with intellectual property, because a lot of people do it, so it's worth talking about. And it was sort of commercially motivated. It wasn't just because you were like somebody who was an activist or whatever. They would actually attack you for commercial reasons. They want to attack people that are doing business deals where the other side of the business deal might be the competitor might be a Chinese company. They would consider spying on the other company. This happens in other countries as well. It happened when Air France was used to spy on some people involved in some European engine deals back in the day by putting microphones in the aircraft. So this happens to some extent, but it's becoming much more of a thing now. And China, the bar for this happening is pretty low, especially for the more broad attacks. And they're incredibly technically sophisticated. Like, you never ever want to underestimate your adversary. They don't waste resources in doing the most advanced attack all the time on everybody, but they are capable of doing very, very good quality work. We've seen lots of exciting DDoS that they've done, where they're able to do adaptive DDoS and resource consumption. That was exciting. They do generally very, very good quality work when they need to. So we want to have sort of a general philosophy of what to do. You don't want to be targeted for special treatment. You want to make sure that you're part of the biggest group, that's with the most people that are the least interesting as possible. So you don't want to wear necessarily your hacker conference t-shirt going through customs. You don't want to necessarily have a device that's like unbreakable, black, super secure phone 10,000. You want to have stuff that's pretty boring. You want to be as boring as possible. But you want to be boring in like in a good way. You don't want to look like you're completely poor and like can't afford your time in the country. You want to be inoffensive but boring. So like a general business traveler, general tourist is generally pretty good. And if you get targeted at all, you don't want to push back of like, oh, I know my rights, you can't do this to me. You want to be as chill as possible for as long as possible so that they don't like make you more of a target than you others will be. But you don't want to do anything stupid. You don't want to expose yourself more than you have to be. And everyone here is a technology person, so you want to use technology to help you as much as you possibly can. So just because you're traveling, like regular security doesn't go out the window. So you still want to do all the standard stuff that you do. You want to have full disk encryption on your machines. You want to have passwords that are reasonable passwords. Multi-factor authentication is great. Screen locking is great. Choose secure devices if you can. All this normal stuff that is sort of like not terribly new to people, but you still have to do it. The thing that's sort of unique about travel is it's not like you're always at your highest level of risk. You have the concept of like at home you have less risk, and when you're traveling you have greater risk. This doesn't really apply for somebody who is always at the target or something, but for this travel stuff it does. So one easy thing you can do, which I must admit I do somewhat but don't do particularly as well as I could, is to minimize the threat surface. So don't take every possible computing device you own. You want to sort of limit the amount and variety. If you've got, if you can get away with not taking something, obviously you're better off. The way that corporations deal with this is they say, we have this dedicated pool of laptops that only are going to go to certain countries. They either do it by country or they do it overall for travel. And you sort of trade in your regular computer for one of these travel devices, which works pretty well. It does limit things, but as an individual, your pool size is often 1, so it doesn't really help you as much. One thing that works really well from a practical perspective is if you buy a new computer, dedicate your older computer to travel because the resale value is not so great. But you do need to then balance that out against keeping your system patched and keeping everything else. The thing that's unique about travel versus not travel is you might not want to do auto updates when you're in one of these countries, because a lot of software, like I would say the main vendors like Apple, Google do a pretty good job of authenticating your updates, but there are third-party apps that do not do any sort of authentication. They're not over TLS and they're not signed updates. So there have been cases of people pushing bad updates to software in the field. And that's sort of giving away everything if you do that. So you might want to update before you travel and then not turn off auto updates while you're in the field. And a lot of the security stuff does depend on the platform. So like I personally think iOS is the most secure widespread mobile phone platform out there right now. So in general, if somebody were saying I wanted to take a phone without a huge amount of work into a hostile environment, I would suggest a hardened iOS device. But if you're going to use some other device, you want to make sure you find a hardening guide for that platform and apply all those guidelines. Same with your laptops and everything else. I like OS X, definitely not the most secure platform out there. The other principle is just don't take all your data. So you've got a question of the data that's on your local device, and you've got data that you have access to. So if you have a lot of work data and you're going on a personal trip, you probably don't need to, and it's a great excuse to say, hey, I'm going on a vacation, I'm not going to do any work for the next week, and just not take your company email account, not take your company email archives, not take stuff like that. So it's a good idea. This is a pain if you travel and you do a lot of stuff while you're traveling, but don't take stuff that you're like unlikely to need or that you definitely don't need. And yeah, and the other thing is, as I was saying, the attack of a future attack. You don't want to take, if you have like an SSH key that gets access to every system in the world that you have access to, you might not want to take that with you when you go to a country where you might be compelled or either hacked or compelled to disclose it. So yeah, it's probably easier to not bring credentials than to not bring a lot of other stuff. This is more for the corporate kind of environment, but in general, a lot of corporations have like a very artificial work versus personal boundary on their computing equipment. I worked in government stuff for a while where they had a complete crazy policy of like no personal activity on these devices whatsoever, which the problem with strict policies is people violate those policies and then they're already like in violation of the policy. It's much better to have a realistic policy and then like actually enforce that policy. So when you have somebody, like say if you have a corporate executive at your company or whatever who's traveling to a place like China and they're taking one device and you've hardened their device, you probably want to talk to them about their personal accounts. Because if you have like, let's say if like Elon Musk traveled to China with his Twitter account and something happened to that Twitter account and somebody decided to tweet like, oh, Model 3 canceled for like the next 3 months or something, or delayed for the next 3 months, that would be a huge security issue for the organization, even if it's a personal account. And the same thing happens to a lot of other stuff. Plus just the inconvenience. If you've got somebody who's going there for, say, a week to do a deal, and their personal accounts get hacked and all their friends are getting messages saying like, oh, I've decided to like leave my wife and all this other stuff back at home, like all sorts of crazy stuff, that could cause enough distraction to be a problem. So that's a reasonable attack. So you want to incorporate personal accounts for people realistically into training. And then, of course, user training. So this is sort of going back to that problem of the people who travel are often very important or are very convinced they're important. Security awareness training has always been a great idea in theory, and stuff like the thing that I found that works the best is if you show somebody how to do it and then you have them show you back brief like how to do it to you, then you'll see what they actually understand. And what you should do is try to tell them things that they're going to actually do and sort of be realistic. So just make things simple. Like if there's something that's like 90% as good as it could possibly be, that is way simpler, that might actually be the right thing to do. So yeah. So we can talk about all that and then what works. So we have this really useful thing in the China case. I'll talk about the US case later, but the China case is that they're really aggressive at blocking network traffic. So the number one question whenever anybody travels to China or is about to travel to China is, hey, what VPN should I use? What VPN will work? What will get me around the Great Firewall? So that's the perfect time to reach out to the user and sort of like inform them that like your device might get compromised. We need to do all this stuff. Even if they're anti-security, if they don't care about security at all, they'll care about being able to actually make the stuff work. The same thing sort of happens if they're a mobile user and they're worried about like roaming. So it's a great time to educate them. If you just happen to have like travel devices that have great roaming service or have great VPNs already configured, it's really easy to get the users to use those things. So just make things like sensible defaults are especially important for something that somebody's taking just temporarily. Then there's stuff that doesn't work. So people have tried a lot of stuff and I've seen a lot of stuff that works, some stuff that doesn't. So phone companies that are building super secure encrypted phones that are supposed to be resistant against government use for spies. When you travel to certain places, that makes you more of a target than you otherwise would be. So you probably don't want to do that. Chromebooks are amazing in theory and work really well in a lot of countries, but in China specifically, there have been problems because of the Google services being blocked. So you want to make sure you're aware of that and work around that. Desktop as a service is an amazing idea of just keep your data out of the country by working on it remotely. But unfortunately, these countries are often highly correlated with places that have bad network connectivity. And a lot of US hosted stuff is blocked in various places. Like when I go to China, I see like probably 80% of the stuff I would otherwise use is blocked. You have stuff like GitHub that often gets, the problem with the Great Firewall of China is there's not like a Great Firewall of China. There are lots of little local firewalls on each network. So you've got probably about 50 or 60 configurations. And then you've got the exceptions to those that are at various like hotels, meeting centers, everything else. So there's a lot of stuff there. And it's complicated. Things that should work and fail, full disk encryption, great in theory, but there's the compelled disclosure problem of, hey, turn this over. And then we've seen in, this has mostly gotten fixed over the last couple of years, but secure messengers, great idea, but a lot of people leave them with the with long histories in their account. They don't have like disappearing messages set up. And in Turkey, this was a really big deal where there was a local application where, or there were situations where they knew everybody was using this application, and they would just say, unlock your phone and show us this application so we can see your log. So you couldn't say, I'm not using this application, or I don't have a phone, because like they just wouldn't believe you. So you want to make sure you have systems that are designed without permanence, and especially if you had sensitive data right before you left, you wanted to make sure you don't have it. And complicated stuff just fails. So, and the other crazy thing is if you take one laptop with you on a trip, and your trip is for a couple weeks, and something happens and you might be suspicious of the system, you might be stuck using it. So you want to have a systems that sort of like gracefully degrade, and that's a challenge. So there's a lot of stuff that is in the future that's going to be definitely helpful. VPN, desktop service, laptops, phones, and I'll go over these things. VPN. So VPNs is sort of like, there's a huge commercial ecosystem of like pay by the month or pay by the whatever, like sort of cheap commercial providers, and there's a bunch of free ones, and there's corporate VPNs, and these are really separate things. VPNs as they exist today are sort of 20 to 25 years of legacy cruft. There's like TLS, there's IKE, there's like IPsec, there's all sorts of different systems that are all there, and they're designed for different reasons than circumventing firewalls, so you've got a lot of issues there. Tor has done a lot of work around transports that can get around some of these things, and there are some of the commercial VPN services are good, but a lot of the corporate VPNs have the problem of being very obvious to people on their network traffic that there's a corporate VPN. They're very easy to block, they're very easy to accidentally block, and then a lot of the commercial VPNs, because they're used by so many people, become targets for blocking. So there's that. And if people have a lot of computing devices, like I actually don't know how to configure a VPN on a Kindle. I have never tried to do it, and I'm not convinced it's realistically possible. So you might want to do something where they've got an external VPN device if they're, for some reason, need to have a high security Kindle or Amazon Echo. Desktop as a service was largely originally designed around the sort of like network computing dream of I guess it was like the 90s, where you get rid of all the computers or put them all in a data center on site and then have a really lightweight desktop. And it's interesting, but it's sort of evolved over time, so now it's remote. But you've got all these network problems of bandwidth, jitter. Bandwidth is not usually the problem. Latency is not usually the problem. It's actually usually jitter in these desktop as a service that make them really painful to use. And then network the complete outages. So desktop as a service is an interesting area. If you don't have the data in the country, you don't have the data to turn over in the country, so you're in a pretty good position. Better laptops, which is something I've been working on. It's a really interesting idea because the laptop, I mean, people use phones and laptops, but laptops for getting actual work done are a pretty likely device. The biggest problem with laptops is they maintain state. Lots of people have done great work about all the places where laptops keep state. They keep state on, obviously the hard drive or SSD has a huge amount of state, but all throughout the system there's like configuration data, like basically everywhere. There's probably like 50 places on a standard laptop that have some sort of data that's specific to the laptop, and that can all get messed up. And you want to be able to reset that consistently to a known good state and not have people tamper with it. So there's that. There's also the physical state. Like I can look at a laptop and mostly see that it looks mostly like a laptop, but if you were to open the laptop up and swap some chips out on the thing or whatever, I wouldn't notice that in my day-to-day use of the laptop. So physical tampering of laptops is obviously an obvious attack, especially if you leave them in your hotel. So the hardware case here is somebody has a laptop, they travel through customs, and customs or immigration says, oh, we need to do some extra swabbing of your device, takes it away from you for an extended period of time. Maybe you're being questioned at the same time. Or maybe they just say, like, we're going to take this and go do whatever on it. They could be imaging it like software, but they could also be applying hardware modifications to it. So there's all sorts of stuff there. There's that. Phones. Travel to phones. You're taking an expensive phone to a country. There's a lot of sort of general risks of phone security. There's the privacy issues of you're carrying around a spying device with you at all times, but there's also the benefits of you're carrying your device with you at all times. So it's much more likely that somebody's going to let a laptop leave their site for an extended period of time than they'll leave their cell phone out of their site for a period of time. So that's a benefit. And modern cell phones have some pretty amazing security technology on them. Trusted execution environment stuff from the ARM world, the secure enclave on iPhones. So the phone and great operating systems. So there's a lot of positives there, but for the travel market, I mean, we now have like Apple selling phones for like $1,200 or something. I certainly don't consider that disposable. So devices getting cheaper, making them more disposable, making them easier to dedicate to travel is a positive. And unique to travel, there's sort of the hostile carrier risk. If I'm in the US on a carrier, I'm exposed to that carrier normally, but if I go to a new country and put a SIM into that device from a carrier and I'm connected to the network from that carrier, I'm exposed to some new interesting problems. So there's that, and there's that. And there's sort of like a management and visibility issue. So you could build this, and you can have this for yourself, you can have this for your team, anybody else, but it's kind of challenging. So it's complicated, and it's hard enough to do this on your own, or like for regular use. So there's two things. There's the sales pitch to activists, which is this shouldn't be a problem. Like, we should not have to do this. So we should fix this problem at the political level of giving people, like, ensuring that the rights of visitors, of both citizens and visitors to countries are protected. We should make a big deal about it whenever anybody goes against this, and be as public as possible about it and try to get it changed. Because from a political and policy perspective, there is no reason why, like, a human rights activist or a academic or regular commercial person traveling just to another country should have to worry about, like, spy agencies spying on them. So there's that. Unfortunately, yes, this happened, and now we have the U.S. has changed somewhat in this risk. Look, you used to be able to largely make an argument that traveling from outside of the U.S. to the U.S. was not a particularly high security risk, and yeah, sort of, but we now have travel bans that have been litigated repeatedly and may or may not be in place at any given time, and they're changing all the time, and the laptop bans, which are pretty interesting. Laptop bans in the cabin of the flight means that they're checked luggage, which means they're out of your sight for an extended period of time, and I believe the current state of that is that there are 7 countries where those flights to the U.S., those laptops have to be checked in cabin luggage. Some of the carriers are really nice about that, and they take it from you at the airport, and they put it into a nice box, and they're nicely labeled, so all these laptops are, like, in a nice, like, very well organized place, and then you get them back, and they're probably the same as they were before. There's just general heightened suspicion and distrust. There's also the more relevant to this community is the U.S. wanted to apply the same bans to European flights, which would have been very, very interesting because the European organizations refused to allow the laptops to be checked in the cargo holds at all for fire safety reasons. So I believe the current state is that they've said they're going to reevaluate it at some point in time, but like that would be crazy. But we have some good news. We have media that's very active about this. So you see protests at airports whenever this stuff happens. You have organizations like EFF. There's a legal challenge now where I think it was either 9 or 11 people that had laptop searches compelled recently have decided to sue. And I'm not a lawyer, but I think they have a pretty good case. So maybe there'll be some things. And there's a lot of attention to this issue. On paper, there's a lot of legal protections in the U.S. against this kind of stuff, but the bad news is it doesn't really matter if there's a lot of on-paper protections because each airport has their own policies. They really widely vary. I would say even as a U.S. person visiting the U.S., I've had the policies vary by airport, varies by the individual agent, varies by a lot of factors. Racism is definitely a factor in who gets profiled by certain agents, but also maybe they have material non-public information about certain things being a target, like maybe they say everybody, like a certain model of laptop is a target, so maybe at different times they have other information, but in general this is a problem. You have like attacks that are very targeted against people who can't really do anything, they're individuals or whatever, but this is a problem. So from that perspective, I think it's actually an interesting idea to start applying the same kind of protections from that people were applying to travel to places like China to start travel to the US, both because it's a sort of a necessary thing for a small subset of people, and also because if it becomes a common thing that business travelers or hackers or professionals start to apply this level of security when they travel to the US, then that puts a lot of political pressure as well on the people to change things, and it makes this technology get a lot better. Because people going to China is a much smaller market than people from Europe going to the U.S. So there's an interesting possibility there. So my main interest would be what kind of things European resident hackers would consider doing, what level of sacrifices they would make in their computing environments when they travel to the US, like what things would work there, what things wouldn't work, and then once we figure out those things, we might be able to say like, oh, we can guarantee that you won't have other certain things happen to you. So it's an interesting thing, and I'd definitely like to hear from people what their input is on that. So, and thank you very much. Now I think questions and commentary would be the most important. Thanks.
Thank you. I found that, in fact, the U.S. is the only place where I have trouble going into the country, and I never have that much trouble. But a couple years ago, someone finally explained to me that it's probably that I fit the profile of a drug smuggler,
Okay.
and then I learned after that how to avoid looking like a drug smuggler.
Okay.
And I also found that it seems like some airports are worse than others.
Absolutely.
But I wonder if there's a more systematic way of me going about this than accidentally someone explaining it to me. Like if I want to know what profile I fit and how I can avoid fitting that profile and which airport I should go to have the less trouble. Is there any good way of figuring this out?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting idea. So in the U.S., we have a couple of people, like we have domestic travel in a situation which might be somewhat analogous to this. There's a couple of sort of famous hackers who travel with firearms a lot, and they have the same problem of every airport has different policies, every agent has different policies and everything else, and they've actually built up a database of like airport incidents and everything else. So if there were a data collection effort for people, if you could figure out we could probably figure out like 20 factors that are sort of inputs to this algorithm, source, destination, country of citizenship, equipment, type of ticket, things like that, and then see who gets stopped. You might be able to reverse engineer what things are going to be sort of like significant. I'm pretty confident that data that they can machine, like a lot of this stuff is done by customs and immigration working on databases that they already have. It's not done at the time of, there's two sets. There's stuff that they do based on factors that they know about in advance, either from the automatic passenger identification information they have or other information. There's also stuff that's done purely by hunches by the individual customs or immigration person. It's pretty hard to predict what the individual customs or immigration person is going to do, but what things are going to key the API is a thing. Maybe looking at what things key TSA, the Quad S Select D stuff might be a factor. But yeah, I think, definitely drug smuggler and person likely to overstay visa is the other category that a lot of people fall into, where they ask about like employment-related questions. You could probably build up profiles there. The problem is once you start doing a public effort to build up those profiles, then they're going to feed that maybe back into their model, but they're not the most nimble or whatever organization, so probably you could be ahead of them. But yeah, that would be an interesting thing to sort of have a community-driven database of like which things are factors. The problem is I think a lot of those factors are, I mean, some of them are very changeable. Other ones, like your country of birth or country of citizenship, are a lot harder to change. And so part of the problem here is that the same people are being targeted. Like if there's like a 1% of people get searched, or 1% of visitors get searched, it's not like uniform 1%, it's the same people getting searched over and over and over again, which is bad from both perspectives of being unfair to them and from a not catching people perspective. So yeah, but yeah, it's a problem.
Thank you. That's all very helpful. I'm going to look into this. Just one note about the drug smuggler thing. I think I know a bunch of people who will probably also have fit in the same profile, and there are a lot of easy things to change about yourself that you don't have to change your country of citizenship.
Cool.
You just carry different things with you.
Oh, cool. Do you want to share any of those that work?
Yeah, my problem is I don't carry very much stuff.
Yeah.
Like this.
Yeah, one bag is about.
So, and I look like I have, like, I'm not poor.
Yeah.
And, I guess, like, this looks kind of nice, right? But I'm not wearing a suit. So, and I don't have a job. So like,
Yeah.
so like, where did I get my money from? It must be from drug smuggling, right? Well, no, like it's just because I don't spend that much money.
Yeah.
But so I carry an extra bag with me, in like empty bag inside this one, and then I pull it out before I go through the customs, and I put a jacket in it, so it looks like I have more stuff. And then I'm traveling alone, and I'm male, so I strike up a conversation with a female, so it looks like we're dating, and we're traveling together. And
This would be very useful information if you were also a drug smuggler.
yeah, that's the really unfortunate part. Like just existing,
Yeah.
like this is really a problem. So just my existence trains me to be a criminal. So if I actually did want to be a criminal, I'd be good at it.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, the question is, do those things actually strongly correlate with actual drug smugglers or not? Like, I know that the Nigerian gangs, that I just read a book, Narconomics, which is actually a great book about the economic theory applied to drug smuggling. Nigerian gangs smuggling drugs into the U.S. are mainly using women with U.S., U.K., Caucasian background, U.S. passports to travel to smuggle drugs into the U.S. because they're less likely to be profiled. So it's really this weird cat and mouse game, which is crazy. So. What else?
So I just want to preface this by saying that I always travel in a suit, and I've never had a problem, and I've never been questioned at all. I mean, I have global entry. I mean, up until I think about maybe 6 months ago, when you have global entry, you basically wave a receipt at the person who's checking your passport, and then you just hand it to them and walk through. You don't even stop. But now I've noticed that, and this first happened when I boarded my flight in Mexico. Somebody came up to me in Spanish and started talking to me in Spanish and said, "Oh, hi, I'm just here. I'd like to ask you some questions for security. What's your profession?" "Well, I'm an accountant." "Who do you work for?" "Oh, I'm independent." Wait, what? And that's when the questioning starts rolling off the rails. Is like, what do you mean you're independent? And I said, "Oh, I have various different clients in Gringolandia." And Gringolandia is kind of a, it's a Mexican Spanish way of saying the Disneyland of the gringos, meaning the United States. And then that's when he was like, "Okay, everything, you're fine, everything." So I go to Detroit, which is my first leg, and as I'm boarding my flight in Detroit, going to Paris, an American, I think it was actually CBP, Customs and Border Protection person, asked me, "So, what's your profession?" "Okay, this is weird." And I said, "I'm an accountant." "Who do you work for?" And I said, "Oh, I'm independent." "Go talk to that guy over there." And so I go over to talk over to the plainclothes supervisor, and we end up having a long conversation about how Bitcoin's kind of a fraud and blah, 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 because that's what you tell a person who works for the federal government. And I'm just wondering, where did this particular line of questioning come from? And in a larger sense, do you have much experience about how other countries are strictly emulating or basically following orders from US CBP on flights that are inbound or outbound from the US?
Okay, yeah, this is interesting. The U.S. outsources a lot of their CBP screening to the distant end of international flights. So you have U.S. customs people that are actually based at major international gateways. They do the screening there before you come to the U.S., which is good because it means you don't have to do it when you get in, and those people are usually a little bit more attuned to whatever the local situation is, and or they're generally like easier to deal with. But you can definitely tell when they've recently been like refresher trained by people back in the U.S. or changed. I've had those people have varied more than any other thing. Like even Frankfurt, which has a huge volume of travel to the U.S. Like I've had them be crazily paranoid at various times. Yeah, definitely business travel. If you wear a suit or if you have just a button-down shirt, whatever, you're going to fit a profile that's going to get you a much less intrusive set of questioning than a lot of other stuff. Like I think like a pot leaf shirt or whatever flying from Amsterdam is like the stereotypical bad idea. But although in that case, if you're not a citizen, sometimes you get questions about are you working in the U.S. if you're coming as a tourist. So you need to have something that's consistent that fits whatever they're going to do, that raises a little suspicion as possible. But yeah, I've seen them vary completely, and I don't know what their training is. The other exciting thing is that the screening that happens to you when you go into an airport before you get into the airport is almost always funded. It was funded by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, where they screen your personal luggage and everything else before it gets into the airport. Some of it's done for anti-terrorism now, but in the early 90s, I think it was all funded by DEA to do that screening. So it's sort of lots of tentacles that have gone to other countries and done that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. Really nice, very interesting. I've been traveling a lot for work, but you mainly focused on the US area, which I don't have too much experience. I can share a couple of stories afterwards, off cameras. What I've noticed, however, because when I travel for work, I usually wear a suit, right? And it's about who you're dealing with. And what I've done over the years is that I get my mind into a state that I want to go through security as fast as possible, and it's a power game. So if you start thinking like that, and not in a point like you get nervous or you don't, oh my God, I'm gonna get stopped again. It's putting yourself into this situation. If you start looking at the people, they are on the security and the way that they are treating people and the way that they are looking at people, you just need to adapt to that and see it as a game and bring your mind to a state that you're going to play a game now. I've been stopped more times with a suit traveling around Europe than with normal clothes for some apparent reason. I don't know why. Statistically, I was stopped more with a suit. I don't know why. However, if you want to go through with a suit and not get stopped, it's not about the suit. It's about the movements that you do, the way that you walk, the way that you look at the time on your watch. There are some minor things like what kind of shoes that you're wearing. So they train on these little details, and that's why they stop people in certain areas. But there is no, because you talked about a generic pattern. It's not a generic pattern. It's depending on the airport, depending the people that you're dealing with, depending the culture of the people that actually are forcing the checks. So I don't know if you can think of any examples based on this input, because I'm definitely you would have like a lot more stories to tell us with more than 100 characters.
Yeah, if you're going to a tourist destination in a suit, you're going to, and everyone else is not in tourist stuff, you're going to be more of a potential outlier. You just don't want to be an outlier. You want to be like everybody else on the flight and be as boring as possible. It's maybe better to be a little bit, err on a little bit more dressed up, but a suit going to a complete tourist destination alone, where everyone else is like couples or families, that's going to be the person they want to talk to. The other thing that I found that works really well is if they ask you a question and you give them stupid additional information that they don't want, so they realize they really don't want to talk to you because it's just going to be a stupid story about, oh, I love visiting this country, I've just gotten here and all this other stuff, they're like, yeah, go ahead. So I very consistently get welcome back, sir, when I come to the US, and I get very similar treatment in other countries by just being as boring as possible. The most interesting experience I've ever had at a border was I went to Montreal for recon, and the Canadian guys there, going to Canada from the US, not usually a very big deal. They were like, why are you, and I have a fast pass to get to Canada. They asked me all sorts of questions, and I had to pull up the conference website and sort of explain to them what reversing is, what recon is, and everything else. And I think I convinced them that they should go to this conference, but yeah. So yeah, it was pretty fun.
One of the tips you just brought to mind, one of the tips that I tend to use when going through or in around the U.S. is answering yes or no questions with yes sir, yes ma'am, no sir, no ma'am.
Yep.
Automatically makes them assume that I was in the service, which means that I'm not a threat. That's just a little hack.
Well, that's cool if you're going into the U.S. It does not help you if you're going into, say, Russia as a U.S. person. Yeah. So you really need to have a consistent. Yeah.
This is just for the U.S.
Yeah.
Again, I'm always just trying to guess what the policies are, and so. But what I wound up doing is there are all these other issues with airports that make me not want to deal with them. So I just try to avoid flying. And then still the only place where I imagine having any trouble is the United States, which I still try to avoid because it's so annoying to get in. I mean, scary, not annoying. And I wondered, if it's a better idea if I want to go to the United States for me to go to Canada and then go by land versus going directly to the United States.
So yeah, Canada, like back when people were doing the potential all laptops banned to the US from everywhere, everyone immediately thought they would go to Canada and then drive into the US. The only place where that's really easy, I guess, would be Detroit, Windsor. There's a lot of places where that makes sense. It obviously doesn't make sense if you're going, like, flying into Vancouver and going to Seattle is like a 2 or 3 hour drive. Okay, so yeah, it is. I mean, Canada's awesome, so I would recommend going to Canada just on its own. But I'm not sure the border crossings by land, assuming you're going by a private car, are usually pretty relaxed, but they can spend a lot more time searching if they want to, and there's volume issues. So the only ones I know about really in depth are the 2 crossings north of Seattle, between Seattle and Vancouver, and I've had like a 2-hour everything in my car torn apart for no reason whatsoever done there, and then 99% of the time it's just like wave you through. So I think it's like a higher standard deviation of pain there, but or higher variance of pain. But I think if you knew that you were routinely getting screwed with by flying, then it might be worth considering. I don't know if I would do it otherwise, and I think it would look weird if you didn't have a reason to be in Canada. I think if you could say, I was in Canada doing something and then I'm coming to the US because I'm coming to the US for some other good reason, that makes sense. But like, I'm going to Canada first because I don't want to go through US immigration at airports is probably like a bad thing to say. So yeah. But also, flights are really cheap to Canada. So it is a viable strategy. I know people have talked about doing it. I don't think it's been a problem for long enough for people to have a good amount of data. Like the drug smuggling crazy thing in the US has been like 30 years and we have a lot of data on that. The last year of craziness has been evolving over the last year. So,
yeah. Just to follow up on your point, I would recommend using the Ambassador Bridge crossing. There's 2 crossings from Canada into Detroit. There's the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel and there's the Ambassador Bridge. Always the Ambassador Bridge. Never cross over through the tunnel. Just for lots of different reasons. But I would actually recommend flying into the US through Detroit or through Atlanta on Delta if you're doing first-time ESTA, because they deal with the first-time ESTA. If you're going into the United States under the visa waiver program, you'd be flying in under what's called first-time ESTA, which means that the first time you enter the United States under the visa waiver program after filling out the form online, you're going to go through a longer interview process. But in Detroit and Atlanta, because they have the highest volume of international people flying in, aside from New York, that you're much more likely to be admitted through either of those 2 points of entry as a first-time ESTA, with no other considering threat profile. Because everybody flies to New York for the first time, and because New York is subject to a much higher level of terrorism, things like that, everybody who goes first-time ESTA to New York that has some slight problem with their record just gets automatically sent back. And people, just in my experience, have had much better luck flying Delta. I mean, with Atlanta's neither Atlanta nor Detroit being their final destination, but being the main entry point for which they go to somewhere else. That's just something that I've noted from talking to a lot of people, because I talk to a lot of people.
cool.
Any more questions?
Could you talk a little bit about your experiences with global entry and what you know about the similar global entry programs that countries like Canada, Mexico have just started piggybacking off the back of?
Yes, if you can possibly get one of the routine entry cards to the countries that you visit a lot, you are it is totally worth it. You're like paying one-time hassle of sign up and some level of background investigation, but you get a lot more like definite fast entry and zero pain. So Nexus, which is the US-Canadian one, and Global Entry, which is another one, are great if you're possibly eligible for them. The other cool thing is in Asia, we have this thing called APEC, Asia Pacific Economic council, where if you get the card and you're from any of the countries that borders Asia, and I think some European countries also can do it now, you go through the diplomatic lines at the airports, and it's awesome. Other systems like Privium in the Netherlands, there's the e-gate system for non-European people entering Germany. There's a lot these systems. If you're going to routinely travel somewhere, these systems are totally good because you're going to get the same background investigation done to you no matter what. I would just rather have it done once and when it's on my time rather than like after a 12-hour international flight when I might get sent back. So. Yeah. Cool. I think we're
Okay, no more questions.
cool. Thank you.